If anyone in Hollywood had two brain cells to rub together, this would be the next Game of Thrones. So today we're talking about Aerosmith. It's an indie comic published by Wildstorm. It's a book that doesn't get a lot of attention. Not a lot of people have probably ever heard of. Probably less people than that have even read it. But I always thought it was a really solid book that never seemed to garner the attention I always thought it should. It was nominated for an Eisner, which is kind of like the Oscar of comic book awards. I don't think it won, but it was nominated, and that's always nice. But it's one of those books no one ever really talks about. I never hear too much about, and I think that's an incredible disservice to the awesome writer and artist who worked on it, Kurt Busiek and Carlos Pacheco. The book itself is set in World War I, except in this reality, there's magic. So magic has been weaponized, and we're seeing, much like we saw with World War I, first mechanized war we saw on this planet. This is the first war we've seen in this world where magic has been weaponized to such a destructive degree. We follow the main character, Fletcher, through his training, his abilities as they develop. He learns how to fly, which is actually a pretty good flight sequence in the comics, just showing this like sheer joy of being able to fly and what that might be like. And to do so, they bond with dragons. These are small dragons that perch on your shoulder, and they wrap their ankles in scales from that dragon's parent dragon. So they form bonds with the dragons, and the dragons are fighting right alongside these soldiers in the war. So it's really kind of cool to see them interacting with the dragons and learning to train with them and creating bonds with them, and then those dragons then assisting them through their combat. They play a lot with how awful war is and the reality of it and the horror of it, and how people, idolize war before they go to war, and then when they get there and actually are faced with the reality of what war is, have a very hard time coming to terms with both what they've seen and perhaps their own actions, depending on what they've done. And this is like a mix of like Band of Brothers and Lord of the Rings. It has the gritty realism of Band of Brothers and showing the horrors of war, while also having a fantasy and awe-inspiring element when the characters encounter different magical creatures, or they access their powers for the first time, or they triumph over some great enemy on the battlefield. So I think this kind of stuff really lends itself perfectly to, I'm sure, what Hollywood wants to do for the next Game of Thrones. There's a lot of really great world building in the book. One of the things they did, I thought was kind of a nice allegory. The whole history of the world is changed. So it's not the United States of America, it's the United States of Colombia. And I'm sure somebody way smarter than me with like a history degree could tell you why they made some of these changes. But the creators of the book did write over 1,000 years of history prior to the war starting. So they can show have an idea for how all the geopolitics played out, the different alliances that ultimately led to the conflict that we call World War I. The main character, as he journeys across America to get ready to sail overseas to fight in the war, he goes to New York and he visits Ellis Island. They show the processing room for what we remember in the history times as like all the immigrants being processed and coming in, and people with very foreign sounding names being assigned names like Smith and Johnson, very like American sounding names. So we see that in this book, but the characters coming over aren't minorities. They're fictional characters, they're creatures. So it's golems and goblins and wizards and warlocks and all these different characters coming through. So I thought that was kind of an interesting twist on the immigrant experience, and trying to find their own way through the new world, away from a continent ravaged by war. One of my favorite artists draws the book, Carlos Pacheco. This isn't the first thing I've read of his, but as soon as I saw his art in the pages of Avengers and a couple other comics, I kind of gravitated towards anything he was drawing. He's a highly underrated artist. He's one of my favorites. In this book specifically, anytime this guy gets a chance to draw figures in flight, I'm always delighted. He does really great poses for his figures. They always look like they're actually moving through the pages. Very dynamic figure work. He's a great storyteller, and this book really showcases like the design aspect. He really does kind of build an entirely fictional world, not only set over 100 years ago, but has all these fantasy elements to it. That it's an interesting blend that you don't typically see. So this book it's very dense in terms of the world building. So I don't think it's for everybody, but I think anyone who's a fan of history or who's a fan of magic systems and how people can weaponize magic, if you're interested in any of those kinds of things, I think this is a book for you. It is a book based on World War I, so there is violence, there is war, there's just insane death and destruction. I think if you were interested in comics and you were interested in history times, this book's a pretty solid choice. So if you like this content, want to see more like this, feel free to subscribe. If you want to find me on social media, I'm on Instagram at The Brave Butter Pecan. If you want to find Aerosmith, you can find it at your local comic book store. If you don't know where your local comic book store is, you can go to comicbookstorelocator.com. They'll show you the closest ones in your area. And if you want to hear more of my opinions on things like this, I co-host a weekly podcast called Caffeinated Comics. You can find that wherever you find your podcasts.